And then share screen.
Yeah, try that.
Hi, from the beginning. There it is. Hello, and welcome to this NCEA presentation, Empowering Students to Become Confident Writers. My name is Beverly Chin, and I'm a professor of English at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana. Welcome to this NCEA session. I'd like to share with you a little bit about myself. I have had over 40 years of teaching experience, and I love teaching. I have taught at the elementary, middle school, high school level, community college level, and university levels. I am a past president of the National Council of Teachers of English and a former board member of the National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. I am also the senior project consultant for the 2011-2017 frameworks of the National Assessment of Educational Progress. Many of you may know this as the nation's report card. I am also very proud to be the author of Grammar Workshop, Tools for Writing, grades 3 through 5, and Grammar for Writing, grades 6 through 12, both published by William H. Sadler. Sadler School is a proud sponsor of NCEA. Today's agenda for empowering students to become confident writers will include these parts. Sentence fluency. We will then look at sentence combining. We'll look at specific examples of sentence combining in stream topics. I'll show you examples of how you can use sentence combining to improve sentence fluency with argumentative, persuasive writing on the topic of endangered species. We'll also be looking at examples of research writing with religion and art. And finally, informative writing with the topic of ecosystems and climate. Throughout this workshop, I'll invite you to pause the session and take notes or consult with a colleague and think about how this activity can be helpful for you and your students. Again, I'd like it to be as useful and as practical as possible. And all of this is very much research-based information. So let's begin with thinking about why some of our students might write short, choppy sentences. Sometimes students are concerned about correctness over the meaningfulness of their writing. So it's important to focus on the meaning of the message first, and then after the meaning is clear, help students to correct for spelling, punctuation, and grammar. Sentence fluency is an important part of meaningfulness in written language. Sentence fluency can be defined as this. Sentence fluency is graceful, varied, rhythmic, almost musical. It's easy to read aloud. Sentences are well built. They move. They are varied in structure and length. Each one seems to flow right out of the one before. Strong sentence fluency is marked by logic, creative phrasing, parallel construction, alliteration, and word order that makes the reading feel natural. This definition of sentence fluency comes from Ruth Cullum in the 6+1 Traits of Writing. I wrote the foreword to this wonderful book, and I hope many of you are using this book with the 6+1 Traits of Writing with your own students. Notice in the definition of sentence fluency, how many words are related to oral language. Graceful, varied, rhythmic, almost musical, easy to read aloud. Each one seems to flow right out of the one before. Wouldn't it be wonderful if all of our students grow in their ability to write more fluid, graceful, varied sentences? That is what sentence combining can do for our students. Sentence combining is a research-based strategy that helps students combine short sentences into longer, more complex sentences. I work with sentence fluency with my students during the revision stage as they're still working with their ideas to make sure their ideas make sense for both the purpose and the audience. Through sentence combining, writers focus on the flow and the rhythm of the sentences in their writing. I am not saying that longer sentences are necessarily better sentences, but I want to help students write more than short, choppy sentences because they're worried about correctness first. As students or as writers combine their sentences in different ways, they discover how their language choices affect both the message and the audience for their pieces of writing. So sentence combining is a very practical, research-based strategy, and this entire workshop for you is going to demonstrate how I teach sentence combining to my students in these different writing genres with different content areas, and also for different ability levels of your students in your classroom. So let's begin. And again, I'll encourage you to pause every now and then and think about how you can use this strategy or how you can engage in the activity yourself. Let's start with looking at sentence combining with argument or persuasive writing. I'd like you to imagine that you have your students writing a persuasive piece of writing about an endangered species. And you might be modeling the example that I'm going to be sharing with you, but each student might be picking different endangered species to write about. Now remember, this is persuasive writing, which means that they're taking a position on whether they agree or disagree on whether that animal should or should not be listed on the endangered species. So here's an example, and we're going to be using gray wolves as the model endangered species for us to work with in our workshop. In sentence combining, you have short, choppy sentences, and you, the teacher, model how you can combine these two short sentences into one longer sentence. Here's the first sentence. Some people support the hunting of gray wolves. The second sentence is, gray wolves are on the endangered species list. Now, again, there are two short sentences and there is information in both sentences. And in sentence combining, we want to, in oral language, show students how we might combine these two sentences into one longer sentence. So here's an example of what you might say. You might say, some people support the hunting of gray wolves, but these wolves are on the endangered species list. Go, oh, you can add a new word in there to enhance the meaning. You might also say, some people support the hunting of gray wolves, which are on the endangered species list. So, oh, okay, slightly different. You might talk with your students, which sentence do they prefer? And which sentence is the stronger sentence, either in support of hunting or not in support of hunting. After you model the oral language part, you can then show students in writing what the two sentences look like. And these are the two sentences I just showed you in oral language. Some people support the hunting of gray wolves, but these wolves are on the endangered species list. Would that be in favor or not in favor of keeping the wolves on the list? Here's the other example. Some people support the hunting of gray wolves, which are listed as endangered species. Maybe that was a little bit more neutral. Maybe the writer hasn't taken a stance yet on whether or not the gray wolf should be on the list or not. So this is an example that you want students to listen to and then look at so they can notice that with sentence combining, you take the information in both sentences, but combine them into one new sentence. You have to use all of the important information. You can add words for clarification. You might change parts of speech, and you can order the information in any sequence as long as it makes sense. Notice that in one sentence it says endangered species list, and in another sentence it says are listed. So that's a change in part of speech. And in the other sentence we have but, which shows a contrast. So these are things for students to notice during oral and written sentence combining activities. Now, let's see what happens on the next step. You've already seen this sentence, some people support the hunting of wolves. You've already seen this sentence, gray wolves are on the endangered species list. What happens when we add a third sentence? Gray wolves are predators. Now what you, the teacher, can do is model how you can put all three of these sentences together into one new sentence. You can also invite your students to write sentences that combine all of this information as well. Again, I encourage you to start with oral language and then follow it with written language. I encourage that because when we talk in oral language, sometimes we're more creative and students can play around with the ideas in different ways with oral language, and then they can land or they can try out different ways of writing these sentences. So I encourage you to do both and oral language and written language. So think for just a moment, how would you combine all three pieces of information, all three sentences into one sentence? And just stop for a minute and think about it. If you were with a partner, you could then share your sentences in oral language or in written language. Let's see what sometimes people come up with. Think again, are you in favor or not in favor of the hunting of gray wolves? So here's some examples. Some people support the hunting of gray wolves, which are predators and listed as an endangered species. Because gray wolves are predators, some people support hunting them, even though the wolves are on the endangered species list. So you can see that there are these two sentences. You might talk with your students, which sentence seems to be in support of the hunting, which sentence might be not in support of the hunting. Word choices make a difference. Starting the sentences with because, even though, change the emphasis of the meaning. But again, all of the information from those three short sentences appear in these new sentences. I encourage students to write their sentences, to share them with each other, and to see how their sentences convey meaning and purpose. So you've seen this sentence. You've seen all three of these sentences. What if we add a little bit more? Gray wolves often attack the livestock of ranchers. Now, ask your students to individually write the sentence that they like. Again, all of the information should be included in this new sentence if possible. They can change parts of speech. They can rearrange the order of information. And then they should keep in mind, if they were in favor of the hunting, how would they combine these sentences? If they are not in favor of the hunting, how would they combine these sentences? Again, going back to what is the meaningfulness of the sentence combining that we are doing. I would ask students to write these sentences, share them with other people, and see whether the sentences are complete and do they make sense to the listener or the reader. I'm going to ask you to, again, think about how you might do this. When students share an oral language, it becomes like, oh, that was just like my sentence, or I used the word which instead of that. Those are still new sentences. Here are some examples of combined sentences. You may have written a sentence like this, or perhaps you even have a different version of these combined sentences. There is no one right answer. These are just examples. Some people support the hunting of gray wolves, an endangered species, because these predators often attack ranchers' livestock. In favor or not in favor of the endangered species listing? Here's another example. Even though gray wolves are on the endangered species list, some people support the hunting of these predators, which often attack the livestock of ranchers. Combines all the information, one complete sentence, but a different emphasis. Because gray wolves often attack ranchers' livestock, some people support the hunting of these predators that are on the endangered species list. Again, you may have come up with a different sentence, absolutely fine. It's not one correct way. It's showing students again that we can combine these pieces of information in unique ways to convey purpose to our audience. And these sentences are more interesting to read than the short sentences that I had started with. For some of your students, if they combine two sentences into one, that's a wonderful growth. Some students can take 3 or 4 sentences and combine them into one. That's a wonderful opportunity also. We are not saying that longer is better, but we are trying to encourage students to write longer, more varied, and more fluid sentences so that the reader is more interested in the writing and the writer's voice shines differently. I showed you at the beginning sentences in a linear form. However, for some students, you can show them the same sentences, but they're now in a more paragraph looking format. Some of the students have a harder time doing sentence combining like this because the sentences are not presented in a list format. One of the things you might have your students do is to go into their own pieces of writing, take a paragraph and have them create a sentence combining activity, but they line up the sentences like I started this exercise with you. So this looks more like students writing, where they write it in a paragraph form and the sentences are short, but students can take their own piece of writing and it may look like this, but then you can turn it into a more visually linear sentence combining, and then they can practice with sentence combining perhaps a little bit more easily. Sometimes when students see this, they kind of say, well, it sounds good to me. But again, through sentence combining, like we just did, they can be a little bit more creative and thoughtful about how they use sentences to convey purpose to their audience. That is an example of using sentence combining with the endangered species for a persuasive piece of writing. Again, after you've done this model activity with your students, you can then have the students go into their own pieces of writing and apply this strategy. It's very important that students begin to see how they can use sentence combining in their own pieces of writing. Let's now look at a different example, and we're going to look at how you can use sentence combining with religion and art. Imagine that your students have each selected a patron saint and a piece of artwork that goes with that saint. With their sentence combining, you might discover that students are writing short sentences and you want to give them more flow, help the students with more flow in their writing. So here's an example of what you might wish to model in oral language and written language with your students. And we're using St. Francis of Assisi with this piece of artwork as our example. Short sentences. St. Francis is the patron saint of animals and ecology. Artists often show St. Francis with animals in natural settings. So these two sentences are taken from the artwork. Again, teachers would model in oral language and later on in written language how one could combine these two sentences. I'm going to have you think for just a minute. How would you do sentence combining? There is no one correct answer, but here are some examples of what you might come up with. Because St. Francis is the patron saint of animals and ecology, artists often show him with animals in natural settings. All the information from the two short sentences into one new sentence. And we started the sentence with because. Here's another example. Artists often depict St. Francis with animals in natural settings to show that he is a patron saint of animals and ecology. Different sentence structure. Information is all there. It's a new sentence. And you can have students discuss which sentence do they prefer and why. Here's a third example. The patron saint of ecology and animals, St. Francis is often shown in art in natural settings with animals. Notice there's a different sentence structure there. If you wanted to teach parts of speech or grammar, these are different ways that you can do it. You have introductory clauses. You can have an appositive. You can show where commas go. You can teach subject-verb agreement. All of these things can be taught after the students do their combining of sentences. Again, the first focus is the message and the meaningfulness of the message. Let's go back to our picture. And you've already seen these two sentences. St. Francis is the patron saint of animals and ecology. Artists often show St. Francis with animals in natural settings. What if we added another detail from the picture? Animals include a lamb, a wolf, a donkey, and birds. Now, how would you and how would the students combine all of these three pieces of information into one sentence? And again, as you work through these ideas with your students, it will take some students time to try out different versions of a sentence to make sure they have all of the information and that it's a complete sentence. Some students like to do it in oral language and then write. Some students say, I need to write. So whatever works for you and the students, absolutely fine. But I do like to emphasize oral language as well. Here are some examples again with that new information. Artists often show St. Francis, the patron saint of ecology and animals, in natural settings surrounded by lambs, wolves, donkeys, and birds. Okay. In paintings, artists often portray St. Francis as the patron saint of ecology and animals and show him with wolves, donkeys, birds, and lamb in a natural setting, a natural environment. Third, by painting St. Francis in natural settings with donkeys, birds, lambs, and wolves, artists represent him as the patron saint of ecology and animals. Again, different ways to combine the information. And you can have students discuss which of these three sentences do they like the most. For some students, that will be the limit of where they can do their sentence combining. Again, encouraging students to keep on thinking and be creative, stretch their sentence fluency. What if we add some more information from the picture, from the painting? In painting, St. Francis wears a plain brown habit. His habit is tied with a belt cord. His feet are bare. St. Francis believed in living simply. Wow, what if the students took those last four sentences and combined them into one sentence? Again, I'm not suggesting that they have to take all of the sentences from top to bottom, but maybe just the last four. Let's see what some people might come up with. And again, I'm hoping that you're thinking about how you might combine these sentences and show varying ways of combining information for your students. In paintings, St. Francis wears a plain brown habit tied with a belt cord and in bare feet, semicolon. This image portrays his belief in living simply. A lot of times, this is a great way to introduce the use of a semicolon because students want one sentence and the semicolon allows them to combine two sentences into one. And they go, oh yes, I've got one sentence, I used a semicolon. Other students put a period and capitalize this. To show St. Francis's belief in simple living, painters depict him walking barefooted and wearing a plain brown habit tied with a belt cord. Now we've got the word barefooted and walking, which wasn't in the original sentence, and that's absolutely fine. You can change words, you can substitute ideas to make the meaning clear and precise. So walking barefooted is perfectly appropriate instead of in bare feet. Because St. Francis believed in living simply, painters show him with bare feet and in a plain brown habit belted with a cord. You may have come up with a different version of combining these last four sentences, and that is absolutely fine. The key is to remember that you want to make sure you use the information and that the sentences are complete and then grammatically correct. In this unit on students writing about art and religion, I mentioned that students might be selecting their own patron saint with visual representations or art representations. You might want to have different students look at different portrayals of St. Francis, and they can write their own descriptive writing based on research and the artwork and create longer more complex sentences that represent the patron saint. This is a good way to have students compare and contrast different representations, which pieces of art represent different aspects of their saints, and how does the emotion feel? How do they feel about what they're looking at in this different in these different works of art? Because they're all about St. Francis, and they can find these presentations, or you can help students find these presentations as they're doing their information and write more descriptively with some research. I like connecting the visual with the written, the oral with the written. It all works together smoothly. So we've looked at two different examples of sentence combining, one for persuasive writing on endangered species, and one on writing about the religion and art together. And now we're going to look at informative writing in science. And in this case, we are looking at ecosystems and climate. Again, you can do it in any kind of informative writing. I've just selected this one to show you how you can do sentence combining in science for informative writing. So we're going to imagine that students are studying ecosystems. And an ecosystem that they might be reading about would be the ecosystem of the Monteverde cloud forest, which is in Costa Rica. Sneed Collard, the author and a friend of mine, wrote this book, illustrated by Michael Rothman, and it's based on his research as a biologist in Monteverde. If you don't know about Monteverde, the cloud forests in Costa Rica, there are over 300 different species of birds, 500 different types of butterflies, thousands of different insects and plants, and it's beautifully, beautifully illustrated. Sneed Collard writes wonderful books about science, and he also writes fiction books that are science-based as well. So I'm going to have you imagine that your students are studying an ecosystem, and this might be a piece of reading, a nonfiction science book that you and your students are engaged in. So in this one, I have some short, choppy sentences, and you might ask students to combine them as you're combining them also. So let me just walk you through this, and then I want to tie it for the reading and writing connection as well. Trade winds blow. The trade winds are tropical. Trade winds blow from east to west. And again, you could stop here and sentence combine all three of these. See which one you and the students like the best. They suck up moisture. The sucking is like lungs. Ooh, how would you combine all of these sentences into one sentence? Students like that sucking like lungs. They think it's funny. The lungs are dry. The lungs are thirsty. The moisture is from the Caribbean Sea. Oh my goodness, look at how many sentences there are now. Can you make them all into one sentence, or do you want to make two shorter sentences? One more piece of information. The sea is warm. So you can differentiate the sentence combining activity, because you can say to the students, if you want to challenge yourself and write one sentence that has all of this information, feel free to do so. If you want to make 2 or 3 sentences, you may do that too. The key is to make the writing clear, make sure the sentences are complete, and include all of the information. So that's a good way to differentiate these sentence combining activities. Also, you'll notice in this one, I did not number the sentences. Some of the students actually prefer having the numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because it helps them keep track. Other students don't need that support. That's fine too. So this is a good way to differentiate for the learners in your class. I wonder what you came up with. Here are some examples of combined sentences using this information. Oh, but before we do that, notice I took the very same sentences and I put them in a paragraph looking format. For your more advanced students, you might offer them this visual version of sentence combining, because again, we've gone from the list format to the more paragraph looking format. This, of course, looks more like their own writing. So the more things look like their own writing, the more likely when they go into their own writing, they can see, I understand where I can do some sentence combining, and they can take their own pieces of writing and make them into a more linear list and try out sentence combining based on their own rough drafts. Maybe even for you, this is a little bit more challenging than the other one, right? See, there's a difference. Differentiation. Meet the students where they are and then help them grow. All right, let's see what you came up with. And maybe your sentences are different than some of the ones that I've created. That's fine too. Sucking up moisture like dry, thirsty lungs. The tropical trade winds blow from east to west across the warm Caribbean Sea. Wow. Look at that descriptive sentence. Notice the commas. Notice that we rearrange the order of the information. But all the information is there, and it's one complete sentence. Here's another example. Blowing from east to west across the warm Caribbean Sea, the tropical trade winds suck up the moisture like dry, thirsty lungs. Another descriptive sentence. Again, all of the information is there. The sentence is complete. From east to west, the tropical trade winds blow, sucking up moisture like dry, thirsty lungs from the warm Caribbean Sea. And you and the students can talk about which sentence they prefer and why. I like them all. Now, you've already seen this version. Again, you saw it in a linear version, and you've seen it now in a more paragraph-looking version. What if you gave students this next set of sentences? The winds travel thousands of miles. These winds are warm. These winds are wet. These winds strike land. So students could now take these 4 sentences and combine them into one sentence. Then you could add another 2 sentences. They rush over the lowlands. Then they begin to climb. Interesting. And again, this is based on ecology. So they are reading information and they're discovering how, even in science writing, it can be descriptive and informative. Have students do the sentence combining, have them share with each other their different versions, see which versions they prefer, make sure all the information is there. And then what you can do is show them what Sneed Collard, the author, actually wrote in Forest in the Clouds. Oh, here's some examples, excuse me. After traveling thousands of miles, these warm, wet winds strike land, rush over the lowlands, and then begin to climb. These warm, wet winds travel thousands of miles before striking land, where they then rush over the lowlands and begin to climb. Very similar, but still organized just a little bit differently. Then you can show students the original version. From east to west, the tropical trade winds blow, sucking up moisture like dry, thirsty lungs from the warm Caribbean Sea. After traveling thousands of miles, these warm, wet winds strike land. They rush over the lowlands and then begin to climb. Students might say, oh, my sentence is just like what Sneed Collard wrote. And other students go, I didn't write my sentences like that. I still like mine, but I can also understand Sneed Collard's sentence. So why do I show this to you? I want you to notice that this is a book about science with wonderful information, but with wonderfully descriptive information and flowing sentences. You can look in the different texts that your students are reading, whether it's about endangered species or science or religion and art. And if you find a piece of writing, a passage that you think is challenging for your students to read, you can take that passage and turn it into shorter sentences that students then combine, much like what I just showed you with the forest and the clouds. I started with this paragraph, and then I deconstructed it, if you will, into shorter sentences and had the students play with the sentence combining. As a result of that, they are actually working with the information. They are working with sentence structure so that when they encounter the original piece of writing, they read it with more ease and comprehension because they've already played around with the ideas through sentence combining. There's a very strong connection between having students do sentence combining based on a text and then reading that text with more ease. So you can imagine that if the students have been doing sentence combining with the examples from the forest and the clouds, and then they actually read the book, they're going, this is so easy to read. Why? Because they've already encountered and played with the information, and they've become familiar with the different sentence structures for that particular piece of writing. So that is a really important aspect of the reading-writing connection. We want students to write like a reader and read like a writer. That's why I've encouraged you to have your students read aloud and to write and exchange their sentences so they can get responses from classmates about how the sentences sound and how the sentences read for their different purposes and audiences. Again, sentence combining is very much based on research, but it's also very practical and very useful for students, regardless of what subject they're engaged in, or whether it's persuasive, descriptive, or informative pieces of writing. For some closing thoughts, I'd like you to think about integrating sentence combining into stream writing assignments. And when you do this, students improve their competency in sentence fluency. They make connections between reading and writing, writing and reading. They can certainly develop critical and creative thinking skills, and they grow as confident, empowered writers. We want students to feel like they have information and ideas, and there's a reason to write and an audience to write to. Doing sentence combining, you are helping the students be mindful of creativity and critical thinking, reading like a writer, writing like a reader, and they begin to grow in both their confidence and their competence in writing. I love teaching sentence combining because it's such a practical strategy that helps the students then apply these strategies into their own pieces of writing. I've written several free professional development ebooks published by William H. Sadler. Again, they are free. You can certainly download these books and use them in your professional learning communities. They're full of ideas, much like the sentence combining activities that I just shared with you. There are also many other very sound research-based practical activities that I think you'll enjoy and that your students will enjoy as well. One of the books is called The Role of Grammar in Improving Students' Writing. Another one is Best Practices for Teaching Grammar at the Elementary Grades. And even though it says elementary grades, middle school and high school teachers use these strategies with their students all of the time. Effective strategies for engaging middle school students in writing and grammar instruction. Again, even though it says middle school students, elementary and high school teachers use these strategies with their students. Teaching meaningful revision, developing and deepening students' writing. Revision is at the heart of improving writing. I really encourage us to spend time thinking about how we help students write more than one draft. And teaching writing in the context of Common Core state standards. All of us have different standards to meet, and the writing strategies in this ebook shares with you effective writing strategies, regardless of which state you work in and regardless of the different strategies or standards for writing. Again, these are all free and they are available at www.sadler.com/school/resources/teaching-grammar-ebooks. I thank Sadler for being a sponsor of NCEA and for publishing these ebooks. I know that you'll enjoy them as well. I have so appreciated you joining me for this session on helping students become confident writers. I hope that you've received some really practical, easy to use ideas for improving sentence fluency in the different subject areas, in different writing purposes and genres. I encourage you to reach out to me if you have any questions or if you'd like to share with me what works with your students. My email is there, beverly.chin@umontana.edu. I do ask that you put in the subject line NCEA 2022 so that I know that this is a question or a response to this particular workshop. I do wish you well. I hope you have a great teaching year and a wonderful time as you implement these strategies with your students. I know that you're all committed to literacy, and I commend you for being wonderful educators for all of your students. Thank you so much and have a lovely day. This is Beverly Chin. Goodbye.